All right, so we looked at does it make sense to have one, rules and regulations. We looked at how you fly it. Um, let's look at what you actually need as far as the drone is concerned to take care of some of the stuff you're trying to do. If this is your first attempt or your first looking into the drone world, the drone is a moving object. It's collecting data with GNSS satellites for positions for your data, which is also a moving object, right? It's a little harder to get two moving objects, a good fix on both. So you have to do some kind of correction to it sometimes, not always is that completely necessary, and we'll look at that also. But if you do want to do corrections, you've pretty much got two choices. You can do an RTK correction and a PPK correction. Most of y'all, how many of y'all are using like Basin Rovers GNSS equipment? You're already using some kind of RTK equipment. Now RTK is going to be the correction for real-time kinematics, where that is located on the Earth's surface in real time. PPK, also a post-process kinematics. It's just figuring out where it is after the fact. Most of your base rovers are going to be RTK, so you kind of let it sit there for a minute. It acquires it, it does its positional change, and it gives you a pretty accurate point. To pull something like that off, you're going to have the collection system. You're going to have all your internal stuff. If this was a LiDAR drone, you're going to have your IMU stuff and your ouster sensor or your LiDAR sensor. And what it's doing is, as your drone is flying, the satellites that it's connecting to is trying to figure out where that drone is in space. And then once it figures out where this is, it can kind of figure out where that point is on the Earth's surface, just like an RTK equipment. You set it up, you do your shot, and you've got a pretty accurate point. Now, if we are doing, yes, sir.
It just has one GPS receiver, right?
Most of them, if it's going to have like RTK or collect the data for PPK even, typically you'll see a GPS receiver to fly it, and then it's going to have a separate GNSS antenna to receive the positional data.
What I'm getting at is it must need the inertial net, the IMU, to figure out if it's tilted in any direction.
Yeah, it'll
not plumb.
Yeah.
So otherwise, it wouldn't know where it's pointed, even if it knew where it was.
Exactly, and ours, a lot of them use a Planix chips. Ours has the APX15 in Discovery too, so it's kind of figuring out the tilt and all that. It'll even give you a report that'll tell you like the yaw rate and all kind of stuff if you just want to take that deep of a dive into it. But it does take all that into account when it's figuring out where it is, the tilt and everything. If we're going to run a real-time correction on the drone, what happens typically is you've got a satellite out in the space, you've got the drone, and you've got your base station, and we're kind of connected to the same satellite. And we're using a link between the drone and the base station to make those corrections in real time. It's not a bad setup, and on a smaller job, you know, it's probably not going to give you any kind of heartburn. If you had a large job, what could you see maybe going wrong in this correction? Getting too far away from the base, and we lose that link. So if we lose the link between the base and the drone, that's the biggest, you know, problem as far as trying to do the RTK corrections. If you've ever seen,
could you leapfrog it? Like
you could, yep. You could if you had a big enough area. A lot of times with like the DJI drones too, if they are doing like RTK corrections, you'll see it stop and it just kind of hovers and it takes its picture or does whatever. And that's just letting it make sure it's got all those links and get the position required and all that. So it's not a bad setup. It's just depending on what product you have and how you're going to process your data.
You could spend more money and get one that's on board, right?
You probably could. I'm not as familiar with RTK as the PPK because that's what we use in the post-process, but you could spend extra money and get something that's a little bit more reliable. Also, I haven't done the process personally because I haven't really had an RTK drone, but some people are saying that you can also kind of link up with like core stations and do your RTK on the drone that way also. Never have tried that, but that may be an option as well. All right, as far as post-process, what this does is you've got the satellite, by default, the drone and the base station that's making the observations, they're going to be sharing some of those satellites in common. So what it does is it makes two independent files. You've got all your observations from your base station, you've got all your positional data from your drone, but it's two separate logs. And then you take those, you put that in your processor, and then it figures out after the flight exactly where it was, and it corrects its position that way. And you'll usually do that in some kind of computer software. Depending on what drone you bought, that's going to determine what software and how those corrections are being made. Does anybody know exactly what the computer is doing to make those corrections?
Just one thing is not moving, and so the other thing is.
It's like he's saying, one of them's not moving, one of them is, so it's saying that it's got a more accurate point here, so let's kind of try to make this data fit this a little better. It does that using an algorithm, so it's doing it with a lot of math. The great thing is, we don't need to know what the math is. We don't need to be able to explain it. We don't care, right? All we need to do is make sure we have a way to test this to make sure we got good, accurate data after the fact. We don't have to explain how it works, and in fact, like Trimble, a lot of their algorithms for post-process, they're proprietary anyway, so they're not going to tell us, what math they're using either, because then somebody could try to hack their system or whatever. So we don't have to exactly understand the math behind it, just know that it's working and how to test it to make sure we got good, reliable data afterwards as far as the drone stuff. All right, so after we looked at these, a lot of people are visual learners, so we've got just a very short and highly technical video that's going to kind of show you a little bit better on a PPK fix how that works. So just bear with me just for a few minutes. I know that technical videos are a little boring, so we've tried to make this one a little bit better. There's a little bit of sound. I only have the computer speakers, so we'll try to hear as best as we can, but we'll give it a shot and see how it works. But this first is going to show how the satellites acquire the drone's position, because that's the first thing we've got to do. So let's take a look. All right, so now the satellites have said, let's get to work. I missed my cue. Now the satellites say, let's get to work. All right, now they've got to get a lock on that drone so they can figure out where its position is. To do that, they've got to acquire the distance. Like I said, highly technical. In a nutshell, it fits. And like I said earlier, I'm not trying to tell y'all what to do, but if you do have one of those little evaluator sheets, we just did work fast and the furious into this. I'm not telling you to circle 4 or 5 or whatever the highest number is, but whatever's been put on your heart afterwards we're concluded. Hypothetically, I'd say write 6 in.
What kind of discount can you give us?
That one's above my pay grade. I better not say anything, especially since it is being videoed. But also, since we are videoing this, for purposes that may pop up in the future for marketing or whatever else, or proof that I actually came and worked today. Since this is a copyrighted clip, I am contractually obligated to mention that Fast and the Furious 73 is currently filming. It will be out in the summer of 2024. All right. So we've got our position locked on. The satellites have figured out where the drone is. It's acquired the distance. But now, like he was saying, there's 2 moving objects. So the drone is trying to figure out what the distance is between those 2 moving objects. And that can be a little harder, than you would think. All right, so he's locked on, he's got his distance, now he needs to figure out everything, but the drone is just not going to cooperate. All right, it's trying to figure out what that gap is. Drone is doing everything it can to make sure that he doesn't figure it out. All right, so there's problems. When you have two moving objects, you're trying to acquire the distance, trying to figure out where it is on the Earth's surface so you get good data. A little harder than it can be. So we need something to correct all that on the back end, and that's where our post-process corrections and all that comes into play. Or you just completely hit the wrong button. All right, so now we've got our RINEX file, we've got all of our data that we collected. We're going to use the algorithm to figure out where that is and make those corrections to that data. The algorithm is going to tell the file what to do. All right, so if you can't hear, he's telling her to get him a little closer, just like that's telling the data to get a little bit closer. Now, eventually, the algorithm figures out where it's at, and now it's going to go help that data so it becomes reliable and we get a good positional fix on it. Drone's still trying to make things difficult, but because we had those two independent files that were post-processing, it's not as big of an issue now. All right, and now it has figured out where it is, and eventually we're going to correct the data. I thought this one was just a notch shorter. All right, now we've got our corrected position data, and all is well as far as the world is concerned, and we've got very reliable, good positional data. Of course, our PPK solution works on everything, not just L2. I just kind of stuck with the theme since he jumped onto the truck.